Good morning, everybody. Welcome in Aix, and for the people online, welcome. We are really sorry for this inconvenience. We had some transport problems and then also a hacker attack. The university Wi-Fi network. So there is definitely a conspiracy against this workshop. So we are really glad to have you all here today and to start this, hopefully, fruitful discussion. So I would like to briefly introduce the idea that is behind the workshop and its scientific ambition. And I will then leave the floor to Norik, who will delve a little bit more in detail into the literature on the link between religion and race. So this workshop is part of a two-day event that Norik and I have organized in partnership with the ReLRace research program led by Vincent Villemain, in collaboration with Maud Michaud. So this program aims, I quote, to reinterrogate the notion of race in a cautious, precise, and detailed manner by disconnecting it, on the one hand, from the history of racism, and by approaching it, on the other hand, from a new prism, that of religion. So this two-day event is the result of stimulating discussion on the missionary phenomenon in the Middle East that began at a conference in Rome in the framework of the MISMO project, which was a research program on Christian mission in the Middle East under the leadership of Neveu. And after that, we started a collective reflection on Christian, Muslim, and Jewish preaching. And these two projects showed that this phenomenon, preaching and mission, cannot be clearly understood and investigated without taking into account the gender dynamics that underlie them, but also the notion of race. Indeed, the link between religion and race have been explored in the missionary context, especially for what concerns Africa, but this is not the case for the Middle East. Yet, in the first half of the 20th century, Arab missionaries, both men and women, frequently complained to Vatican representatives about the racism of their European fellow. And I would like to quote just a short excerpt of a petition that was sent to Monsignore Testa, which was the apostolic delegate in Palestine, by a group of novices in 1952. So I quote, "We, the undersigned, testify and declare that Brother Pacifico attacked novice Theophilus Cattan with frequent insults, without novice Theophilus giving him the slightest provocation, but because he is simply an Arab. Brother Pacific uttered the following words against novice Theophilus: Arab, Bedouin, pig, snout. And as novice Cattan was passing by, he said to the workers, look at this animal passing by." So this is one of the many examples we can find in the Vatican archives of petition addressed to Vatican representatives by local religious and novices. Many other concern women missionaries who complain about the fact that their European fellow treated him badly just because of being Oriental, Eastern. So more or less at the same time, the training of an indigenous clergy was justified on the premises of the proximity of race, who would have facilitated the conversion. And I quote just a brief excerpt of a booklet that was published by the Franciscan missionaries of Egypt in 1930, saying, the indigenous nun is destined to carry out a unique activity in her country and among her compatriots, particularly in the family environment and among people of her own sex, which cannot be replaced by the foreign nun. Knowing the customs, social convention, tastes, and weakness of her race, she has a better chance of spreading the maxim of the gospel. So these few quotations point to the relevance of taking into account the articulation between religion and race in missionary field, and raise the question of racialization of the population targeted by European missionaries in the missionary field. So starting from these few preliminary observation, the aim of this two-day workshop was to analyze in which way missionary institutions in the modern era were able to integrate the notion of race and implement it in their practice. So the first workshop took place at the University of Le Mans in March 2023, and it explored the contemporary uses of the concept of race in contemporary missiology, as well as the vocabulary and themes of raciology that developed in the 19th and 20th century in the missionary writings. This second workshop here in Aix proposed a threefold shift in terms of subject, approach, and field. The first shift consists in focusing more on practices and operating methods. So we aim to observe how racial thinking and stereotypes were deployed in the field and in missionary practice. And the contemporary period is particularly fits this question, while the 19th century represented a new missionary impetus, as well as the apogee of racial theories and colonialism. The racial theories were disqualified after the fall of Nazism and the colonization. However, this anti-racism in principle has not necessarily been accompanied by the disappearance of the notion of race and the discrimination practices related with it. So what about the missionary context? So the second approach is to provide a cross perspective between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. The aim being to decompartmentalize the analysis of the missionary phenomenon by shifting the focus behind Christian churches. And to do so, we take into account the Muslim missionary deployment, dawah, carried out, for example, by the Ottoman authorities in the Middle East, or by openly missionary movement like the Tablighi Jamaat, which is literally the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, founded in India in 1927. From the end of the Ottoman Empire, indeed, Muslim missionary action developed, particularly in the so-called Arab provinces of the empire. And these missionaries advocated reform based on the presumed backwardness of the targeted population. So we wonder, what role did race play in these discourses? Initially, our ambition was also to integrate the analysis of multiple phenomena aimed at re-Judaize Jews, like the example of the Alliance Israélite Universelle approach of the Jews in the East, North Africa, or more recently, other re-Judaization movements that aim to re-Judaize Jews all over the world, and then that can be likened to a form of internal mission. Finally, the third approach is the geographical scope. So the idea was to broaden the perspective to areas other than the Middle East, taking into account the global dimension of the three monotheistic religions and the transnational phenomenon par excellence that is the missionary phenomenon. So this triple approach goes along with an interdisciplinary perspective, which aim to bring together historical approaches with other approaches firmly rooted in an anthropology of religion. And this enables us to rethink the notion of mission in the light of its contemporary expression and development. So I maybe leave the floor to Norik.
Yeah. So maybe briefly, if I can. The idea is just to quickly discuss why does race matter in the perspective of analyzing missionary dynamics or preaching dynamics. One of the first observation we had together, but that few scholarly attention has been given to the understanding and unraveling to understanding the role of religion in conception and practices of racial exclusion and discrimination. So it is precisely the blind spot the AMU ReLRace program aims to tackle, and that's why we were really enthusiastic in sharing this event with this team. So one of the hypotheses of the project is to show that not only can religion accommodate race perfectly, particularly at the age of so-called scientific raciology in the late or in the 19th century more broadly, but that they are also capable, religion, of producing it over the long term. So that's also one of the perspectives I think we will all embrace together today, well before the emergence of the notion of race from natural history. So that's again something I think we will discuss together today. Missionary venture provides scholars with an opportunity to observe the elaboration and the implementation of a grammar of differences based on race, among other categories of differentiation. Of course, class, probably, or social background, gender, blah, blah, blah. So maybe one of the questions we would like to raise today is how we can study the intersection also of this different kind of, within this grammar of difference. A whole stream of research, especially the in English, let's say, English language historiography, has recently examined the relationship in between race, religion, and colonialism in the missionary context. And I think we all know or are familiar with this literature, which is, I think, more extensive on Asia and sub-Saharan Africa or Africa. We were discussing with Anna that we don't have such extensive historiography on the Middle East, even though we have examples like the White Fathers in Algeria, which have been studied by many colleagues. But they are, this area of studies also matches with inner investigation of the intersection in between missionary perspective and this notion of race. So how did missionaries absorb and or resist the dominant colonialism of the early 20th century? How did missionary action encourage the emergence of ethno-nationalism? These are some kind of issue that has been raised by different colleagues, and for instance, in the case of Fiji, by Kirsty Close-Barry. So, however, most of this research, and as I said, which mostly focused on Africa and Asian continent, examine the integration by the missionaries of racial theories and stereotypes based on racial exclusion in terms of color line and the reproduction of them in missionary practice. Except for a few studies, the role of religion in the processes of racialization have yet to be studied, as well as the post-colonial feature of the link between race and mission. Moreover, the experience of racialized clerics or religious figures remains largely under-researched, including by subaltern studies, often for reason of access to sources, or more simply because of scientific concerns. Because as just Anna just mentioned before, even in the main, in the archive of the main religious institution, you can, retrace the voices of those local indigenous racialized figures. So, moreover, the role of and missionary perspectives of these actors remain to be deciphered more broadly through the prism of race. So how do they mobilize this tool or apprehend the local groups and communities where they develop their mission? What are the expectations on demands of the local groups of the faithful in this respect, how that this notion of race is, shaped, reshaped, appropriate, reappropriate, defined by those local communities. And how can we articulate the question of race with other systems of domination? So as I mentioned before, including gender, social status, within the analysis of missionary field experience. And also studies about missionaries' indigenization rarely take into account the role of race, race played in this process. So on the basis of this preliminary observation, this workshop aims to extend the analysis of the race mission link to all religion of the book or all Abrahamic religion, without limiting itself to a specific temporality, and especially without limiting itself to the colonial period. And that's also one of the perspectives of this workshop, which is interdisciplinary. And we really count also on our ethnologists or ethnographists, so political scientist colleagues, because I think it brings also other perspective on the mission itself, on preaching itself, and on this articulation in between race and mission. Really briefly, I'll just present the three main themes of the program we'll share together during this 1.5 day. So there is three main axes. The first one is a discussion on the indigenization of Christian clergy and its effects. As I think most of us know, from the second half of the 19th century onward, the formation of local clergy became an injunction for the Protestant and the Catholic missionary, development of dynamics and church, with effects on local cults and churches. So a consequent number of institutions were created for this purpose: schools, seminaries, local congregation, may they be for men and for women. And the mission were called upon to encourage this indigenization of the male and female personnel or staff by encouraging local vocation as much as possible. And it went with the rise, with the rise of nationalist movement, as well as which had reflection on within the pre-conciliar Catholic Church, and which accelerate this dynamic. So some question we could raise together: how were the injunction to train indigenous clergy implemented, through which institution, and how did they convey and transmitted racial vision, but also how did they created racist dynamics within the church staff? What place did the indigenous clergy occupy in the religious and missionary hierarchy, but also within this training institution? Were they ever part of this training and shaping curricula, for instance, for the local clergy? And how do gender, race, and other factors of differentiation intertwine to produce this grammar of difference within the ecclesial and missionary space? And about the indigenous clergy and this missionary society, what racial perspective can we discuss and try to define together? How do indigenous clergy internalize the racialist perspective that govern the formation, and how also did they then spread it or not on the field when being missionary themselves? The second theme, examine the link in between discourses of racialization and practices on the ground in relation to targeted population. So how do missionaries see the targeted population, and how do this view translate into practices? What links were established between conversion and the racialization of missionary population? did the conversion difficulties encountered in certain areas, for instance, the Middle East? I think also, I mean, this areal differences has to be taken into account. Has missionary sent to the Middle East had no official proselytism function allowed, which I think is quite different in relation to the targeted population, and maybe probably to this relation and narrative about race and the notion of definition of those racial or ethnic categories. So I mean, yeah, and this second section will also try to investigate the targeted population themselves. How do they perceive, reuse, define, and also claim or react to the mobilization of the different categories linked to this notion of race. And the last axis is called combat mission with question mark. So it addresses the question of missionary claims, struggles, and commitments in the name of race or against this notion. The aim of this last axis is to show how these commitments reveal the close interweaving of race and religion, and how race is at the heart of the demands of certain Christian Muslim missionary movement. How do preaching, proselytism, and racial issue intertwine in the discourses and practices of movements such as the Nation of Islam, whose missionary dimension remains little known till this day? So that's a lot of questions, and I know you'll raise much more than this. So, but that was just maybe to open the discussion and get together.